Mother Bear finds this baby in trash and bring it to the hospital. Everyone was in tears. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The night the bear knocked. The winter wind rattled the old windows of Maplewood Clinic, a small-town medical outpost nestled in the shadow of the Rockridge Mountains. It was the kind of place where people had known each other for generations, where secrets were whispered by the pines and carried by the cold river that wound through the valley. But some secrets were too big to stay hidden forever. Margaret Holden, the town's most experienced night nurse, had worked at the clinic for over 20 years. She'd seen it all. Farm accidents, winter sickness, babies born in blizzards. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to witness. It was just past 4 a.m., that strange in-between time when the world is neither fully asleep nor fully awake. Margaret had been restocking the supply shelves, fighting off exhaustion after another 12-hour shift. The clinic was empty, silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Then came a sound she couldn't ignore. A cry, faint, barely audible over the wind howling through the pine trees. Margaret frowned, her heart giving an uneasy lurch. A baby. No one in town was due to give birth. She shook her head, telling herself it was probably a trick of the wind. But the cry came again, thin and desperate. She moved toward the frosted window by the back door, pulling back the curtain with careful fingers, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A bear. A massive, towering grizzly, its thick fur matted with snow and pine needles, its breath curling in the freezing air. But it wasn't the bear's size that turned Margaret's legs to ice. It was what the bear was carrying. In its powerful jaws, the beast held a bundle of cloth, dirty, torn, but unmistakable in shape. And inside there was movement. A tiny hand reached out, fingers trembling against the bitter wind. Margaret gasped. A baby. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Her medical instincts screamed impossible, but her heart knew otherwise. The bear stepped forward, its great paws leaving deep imprints in the snow. It moved with deliberation, not like an animal scavenging for food, but with purpose, like a mother bringing a child home. Then it did something that sent a shiver straight down Margaret's spine. The bear lifted its head and met her gaze through the glass. Its eyes were not wild, not full of instinctual hunger or fear. They were something else. Deep, golden, almost human. Margaret swallowed hard. Every instinct she had screamed to lock the doors, back away, call animal control. But she didn't move. Instead, she reached for the door handle. Her hands trembled, breath coming in shallow bursts. She could hear the baby's cry growing weaker. Too weak. The child was freezing to death. If she didn't act now, there would be no one left to save. Margaret took a deep breath, heart pounding against her ribs, and opened the door. The bear did not lunge. It did not growl. Instead, it stepped forward, slowly, carefully, as though it knew this place was safe. Then, with an impossible gentleness, it lowered the bundle to the ground. Margaret dropped to her knees, reaching out with steady hands. The fabric was rough, stained with mud. She peeled back the top layer and felt her breath catch. The baby's face was blue with cold, lips trembling, tiny chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. A girl, no more than a few days old. No more than a few days old. Margaret's training kicked in. No time for questions. She scooped the infant up, wrapping her tightly in her arms, and rushed inside. With practiced hands, she grabbed a warm towel, a heating pad, an oxygen mask, everything she needed to pull a tiny life back from the edge. The bear stood in the doorway, watching, waiting. Margaret barely glanced up as she worked, but she felt its presence, calm, patient, as if it somehow understood. Minutes passed. The baby stirred, then let out a stronger cry, Relief washed over Margaret like a wave. She looked back up at the bear, tears prickling her eyes. She's going to be okay. The great beast gave a slow, rumbling huff, almost like a sigh of relief. Then, with a final look at the child, it turned and disappeared into the snow, vanishing between the darkened trees. The sun was just beginning to rise. The mystery that followed the baby, now safe and warm, had no name, no record of birth. The authorities searched for weeks, but no missing child was reported in the surrounding towns. No mother, no father, no explanation. And the bear, never seen again. People whispered about it for years. A miracle, a legend. Some said the child had been abandoned in the woods, left to die, and that the bear, somehow, knew she deserved a second chance. Others swore it was more than just an animal, that there had always been stories about something watching over the valley. As for Margaret Holden, she never tried to explain it. She simply looked into the little girl's eyes, golden like the bear's, and knew some things were never meant to be understood. Some stories live in the heart, not in the mind. The night the bear knocked twice the world outside Maplewood Clinic was still frozen in winter's grip, the mountains looming like silent guardians over the sleeping town. The early morning air smelled of pine and frost, a familiar scent to Margaret Holden, who had spent 20 years working night shifts in this remote valley. But that morning, the air carried something else, something that made her heart race before she even understood why. The bear was still there. Margaret had already opened the door once to take the baby from its jaws. She had wrapped the child in warm blankets, checked her vitals, and confirmed that, against all odds, she was alive. But now, as the clinic's security light flickered against the dim morning sky, the bear stood watching. Wait. Its golden brown eyes, sharp despite the frost clinging to its fur, met Margaret's across the threshold. There was intelligence in them, an unsettling depth that made her question everything she knew about wild animals. And then the bear did something that turned her blood to ice. It stepped forward again. Margaret's breath hitched. She should have shut the door, should have locked it, but something in her refused to move, as if part of her had already stepped beyond the rules of logic into something stranger, something ancient. The bear did not charge. It did not growl. Instead, it lowered its massive head and nudged something forward with its nose. A scrap of paper, creased, blood-stained, and fluttering in the wind. Margaret swallowed, her throat dry. This bear wasn't just delivering a baby. It was delivering a message. She knelt carefully, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, her heartbeat a drum in her ears. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind you'd find in fancy stationery sets. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, as if written in fear. If you are reading this, she is alive. Please keep her safe. They will come looking. Trust the bear. Margaret's stomach twisted. Who had written this? Who had abandoned this child? And why in God's name had they trusted a bear? She glanced back up, searching the animal's face as if it might somehow answer her. The bear just watched her, waiting. The baby, now wrapped in a fresh blanket and sleeping in the clinic's incubator, let out a soft whimper from inside. The sound made the bear's ears twitch, its muscles tense, as if it still felt responsible. Margaret's fingers tightened around the paper. Was it possible? Had this bear protected the baby before bringing her here? Had it carried her through the woods, warmed her, shielded her from predators, kept her alive long enough to find a human willing to help? The thought sent a shiver through Margaret's body, because if that was true, then this bear knew more than any wild animal should. And worse, whoever had abandoned this child hadn't done it out of neglect. They had done it out of fear. Margaret stood slowly, her instincts warring with reason. The bear was still watching her, its great shoulders heaving with slow, heavy breaths. She knew she had to act before the rest of the town woke up, before someone saw the bear, and did what people always did when they feared what they didn't understand. The sound of an approaching engine rumbled in the distance, probably Dr. Calloway arriving for the early shift. Margaret made a split-second decision. She stepped forward and whispered, "Go. You're not safe here." The bear blinked, then let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl, not a threat, but something that almost sounded like understanding. Then, without another glance, it turned and lumbered back into the woods, disappearing into the snow-dusted pines. Margaret stood frozen, her breath visible in the cold air. The baby stirred again, her tiny hand clutching the silk blanket Margaret had wrapped around her. Margaret looked down and noticed something she hadn't before. Gold thread embroidered in the fabric. 2 letters. R.A., a monogram. The mark of a wealthy family. A powerful one. Margaret's gut twisted. She had a feeling this was only the beginning of something much bigger than herself. She glanced once more toward the dark forest, where the bear had vanished. Somewhere out there, someone had trusted that bear to deliver this child to safety, and for reasons Margaret couldn't yet explain, she trusted it too. If you're still watching this story, drop a roan in the comments to let us know you're here. But the question remained, who were they running from? The night the bear delivered more than a mystery, the world outside Maplewood Clinic was still locked in winter's grip, dawn barely creeping over the distant peaks. The cold bit at Margaret Holden's skin, but she barely noticed. She was frozen, not by the icy air, but by the presence of the bear. The massive creature had vanished into the tree line, its heavy steps fading into the wilderness, but its mystery remained. Margaret's gaze dropped back to the tiny infant she had just placed on the clinic's examination table. A newborn, a girl, and yet nothing about her made sense. The baby was too clean, unnaturally so. No vernix, no birth residue, no sign of a chaotic delivery. Even the umbilical cord had been cut with surgical precision. The blanket she had been wrapped in was silk, expensive, delicate, and stained with blood. But it was the mark on her wrist that sent a chill through Margaret's bones. A small tattoo, fresh and barely healed. Letters and numbers precise and clinical, like an identification code. Margaret traced the strange ink with gloved fingers, her medical instincts screaming that this baby's origins were not ordinary. Her mind whirled, trying to make sense of everything. The tattoo, the silk blanket, the bear, the surgical gloves caught in its fur. A bear carrying an abandoned baby was impossible enough. But bear carrying a baby that had clearly been born in a medical facility? That was something else entirely. Margaret had spent 2 decades saving lives, but this was different. This wasn't just a medical emergency. This was a message. And she had a terrible feeling that whoever left this child behind hadn't simply abandoned her. They had been running. An unwanted arrival. The front doors burst open without warning. Margaret jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one should have been here this early, but she wasn't alone anymore. 3 figures strode in, moving with a deliberate purpose that made every hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Agent Marcus Chen, FBI. The man in front was tall, with military posture, his coat still dusted with snow from the outside world. A thin scar curved along his jawline, disappearing beneath the neat trim of his beard. Margaret barely had time to process the words before her instincts screamed at her. The FBI already? This had happened minutes ago. How did they know? And more importantly, why did they care? "I need you to step away from the infant," Chen said, his voice flat. Margaret's stomach twisted. "She could go int." "She's not your concern," Chen interrupted, cutting through her words like a blade. Margaret's fingers tightened around the warming blanket she had wrapped around the baby. She didn't like this. The men with Chen weren't dressed like federal agents. Their clothes were too expensive, too casual. And the way they stood, calculated, poised, reminded her of the soldiers she had treated years ago after deployments overseas. Not FBI, something else. One of them, a woman with steel-gray hair and an unreadable expression, stepped forward, pulling a badge from her coat. Dr. Evelyn Monroe, pediatric specialist. She moved toward the baby, but Margaret instinctively stepped between them. Credentials? Margaret said. Dr. Monroe didn't blink. She pulled a laminated card from her pocket, flipping it open with practiced ease. It was perfect, too perfect. Margaret had seen real hospital credentials before, and they were never this pristine, this precise. No bends, no inkware, no minor imperfections. It looked manufactured, like something printed for an official cover story. Margaret's stomach dropped. Something was wrong. And then, as if the universe was confirming her worst fears, the baby stirred beneath the blanket, letting out a soft, exhausted whimper. The noise shouldn't have mattered, but Agent Chen flinched. For the briefest moment, something crossed his face, something Margaret knew too well after years of working emergency shifts. Recognition, not surprise, not curiosity, recognition. Chen knew this child. Trust the bear. Margaret's mind raced. She had to make a decision, fast. Who were these people? Why were they here? And more importantly, why had the bear brought this baby to her instead of them? The bear had known where to go. The bear had known where to go. The bear had waited to make sure Margaret took the child. The bear had left her a message. They will come looking. Trust the bear. She did trust these people. Margaret took a slow breath, pressing her hands against the examination table. She's hypothermic. If you want to take her, you'll have to wait until she's stabilized. Chen's jaw ticked, but before he could speak, Dr. Monroe cut in smoothly. I can handle that. No, Margaret said firmly, lifting the baby into her arms. She's staying with me until a real medical team gets here. Monroe's face didn't change, but Margaret saw it, the tiny flicker of irritation that revealed more than words. She had made the right call. Something in her gut told her that if she handed this child over, she would never see her again. The baby wasn't the only secret. The tension thickened, stretching between them like the stillness before a storm. And then, a sound outside. Margaret wasn't the only one who heard it. Chen stiffened. Monroe's head turned slightly. The third man's hand drifted toward his jacket, toward what Margaret suspected was a concealed weapon. Then, a low, guttural sound echoed through the air. A growl. Margaret's heart jumped into her throat. The bear was back. She saw the shadow first, stretching across the clinic's parking lot in the dim morning light. A massive silhouette, shoulders rippling, breath misting in the cold air. And this time, it wasn't alone. More shapes moved behind it. More bears. Margaret's grip tightened around the baby, her pulse hammering in her ears. For the first time since they entered, Chen and his people looked uncertain. The air in the clinic seemed to shift, the world holding its breath. And then Margaret realized something chilling. The bear hadn't come back for the baby. It had come back for her. The night everything changed. The baby's cry pierced through the dim red glow of the emergency lights, its tone unnatural, melodic, almost resonant. Every bear in the room reacted immediately, their eyes flickering with the same eerie metallic sheen that had first caught Margaret Holden's attention. Margaret's breath hitched as the largest bear, the one that had brought the baby, stepped forward, its massive shoulders casting long shadows against the walls. Its eyes, they were not normal eyes anymore. They shifted, swirling with an electric blue light, alive with something beyond animal intelligence. The integration is complete, Chen muttered, his weapon lowering slightly. Dr. Patel actually did it. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears. What? She asked, her voice tight. What do you mean, integration? Agent Chen's mask of professionalism cracked for the first time, and Margaret saw something she hadn't expected. Uncertainty. That baby isn't just a child, he admitted, finally meeting her gaze. She's the first successful human ursine neural synchronization subject. Project Artis was never supposed to go this far. The floor rumbled beneath them, the vibrations growing stronger, more erratic. "Sir," the third agent spoke up, holding what looked like a tablet made of shifting liquid metal. "The Omega team is breaching the sublevel containment. They're after the core samples. If they reach the quantum matrix..." A sound, something inhuman, something wrong, echoed from below the floor. Not a bear's roar, something deeper, something impossible. Margaret shuddered, the hairs on her arms standing on end. The baby's cry rose in answer, the pitch vibrating through the walls as if responding to something unseen. And then, in the dim red glow, Margaret realized the truth. The bears weren't just protecting the baby. They were connected to her. The facility beneath their feet, lower levels, Margaret demanded, trying to keep her voice steady despite the chaos unraveling around her. "This clinic is a single-story building. What the hell is underneath us?" Chen didn't answer immediately, but Dr. Monroe, the supposed pediatric specialist, did. "This building was never just a clinic," she admitted, her cool composure finally fracturing. "The Pine Grove Medical Facility was built over a research compound buried beneath the town decades ago. The government needed a remote location, somewhere isolated, to conduct experiments." Margaret's stomach churned. "What kind of experiments?" she asked, but she already knew she wasn't going to like the answer. Dr. Monroe hesitated. It was Chen who spoke next. They were trying to bridge the gap between human and animal consciousness. Margaret stared at him. "You mean creating shifters? People who can turn into bears?" she asked, half laughing despite the dread curdling inside her. "No," Chen's voice was grim. "Worse, they weren't trying to turn people into animals. They were trying to merge minds." Margaret's hands tightened around the baby instinctively, her body cold despite the heat rising in the room. She thought back to the bear's eerily deliberate movements, to the strange intelligence in its gaze, to the way it had cradled the child not like a wild animal, but like a guardian. And now the surgical scars along its spine made awful, horrifying sense. "Oh my God," she whispered. The Omega team was here. A sudden explosion rocked the building, sending dust cascading from the ceiling. The security alarms blared, an emergency klaxon screeching through the hallways. The third agent, who had remained silent but watchful, lifted his tablet again, his face darkening. Omega just breached the containment levels. They're headed toward the vault. Margaret didn't know what the vault was, but she knew one thing. If Omega had come all the way to Pine Grove Valley, if they were bringing military operatives, helicopters, and whatever was growling beneath the floor, they weren't just after some classified documents. They were after this baby, and they were willing to kill for her. Chen and his team exchanged quick glances, a silent communication Margaret wasn't part of. The time for secrets was over. If you're still watching this story, drop a "own" in the comments to let us know you're here. "We need to get her out of here now," Chen snapped. "Omega won't stop until they have her. If they reach the sublevel first, we'll all be dead before sunrise." Margaret swallowed hard, then did the only thing that made sense. She looked down at the baby. The tiny girl stared back up at her, her bright eyes blazing with an intelligence far beyond her age, as if she already knew what was happening, as if she understood. Then the bears moved. The largest one, the one that had brought the child, let out a deep, guttural sound, stepping forward. Its meaning was clear. "Follow me," Margaret exhaled sharply, clutching the baby to her chest. Against all logic, against all instinct, against every ounce of training she had ever received, she trusted the bear. The escape begins. Another explosion shook the walls, and Margaret felt the shift beneath her feet, the kind of movement that meant something below them was collapsing. No time, no second guessing. She followed the bear. Chen and his team moved with her, weapons drawn, pushing through the emergency exit as the sound of approaching helicopters grew deafening overhead. Margaret's breath came in short gasps as the cold air hit her skin. The bears moved like shadows, guiding them toward the tree line, away from the facility's entrance. Behind them, the clinic was falling apart, the last remnants of whatever had been hidden beneath its floors being erased from existence. But Margaret wasn't thinking about the clinic anymore. She wasn't thinking about classified experiments or government cover-ups or Omega operatives hunting them through the woods. She was thinking about the tiny child in her arms, about the way the bears responded to her every sound, and about the surgical scars on their backs. The baby was connected to them, and if Project Artus was real, then this baby wasn't just the first successful synchronization subject. She was the key to everything. Margaret didn't know where the bear was leading them. But as she ran into the darkened forest, sirens blaring in the distance, she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of the mystery. It was only the beginning. The choice that changed everything. Margaret Holden barely felt the shattered glass around her, or the violent tremors rocking the clinic. The world was splitting apart both literally and figuratively. And at the center of it all, a baby who wasn't just human. A bear who wasn't just an animal. And a choice that would change everything. The baby's fingers curled around the fabric of Margaret's sleeve, her irises swirling like miniature galaxies. More images flooded Margaret's mind, as though the infant's consciousness was reaching out to her, showing her what words could not. Dr. Paddle, kind eyes, brilliant mind, standing in an underground lab filled with strange, glowing machines. A bear, this bear, stepping willingly into one of them. An experiment not to control, but to connect. Then chaos, alarms blaring, doors being forced open. Men in black armor storming the lab, gunfire, betrayal, a desperate escape into the mountains. A mother bear carrying her child away from those who wanted to turn her into a weapon. Margaret gasped, staggering back, the weight of knowledge crashing into her. The bear, no, the mother, looked at her, and Margaret suddenly knew the truth in her bones. This wasn't just a child. She was the first true hybrid of two species, a being who could bridge the gap between humans and bears in ways no one had imagined possible. The child was the key to something much, much bigger, something terrifying and beautiful, all at once. Omega arrives. The whine of approaching helicopters grew deafening, their dark shapes blotting out the first rays of morning light. Omega was here. Through the shattered windows, Margaret saw figures moving in unison, dressed in black tactical armor, carrying weapons pulsing with crackling red energy. Their helmets obscured their faces, but she could feel their purpose. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to retrieve the child, by any means necessary. The bear, the mother, reared up on her hind legs, standing nearly 10 feet tall, her presence a force of nature. When she opened her mouth, the words that emerged were rough, unnatural, but unmistakable. They come for Quantum Core, must protect the future. A shock wave rippled through the air as the other bears joined her, their bodies beginning to shimmer with raw energy, their eyes burning with the same electric blue glow as the baby's. This wasn't just about saving a child anymore. This was about stopping something monstrous before it began. The impossible battle. Margaret barely had time to react before Omega opened fire. Red streaks of energy shot through the clinic, striking the floor and walls, burning holes where they hit. The bears moved like phantoms, dodging the attacks with unnatural speed, their bodies shifting between solid and something less tangible. Something Margaret's brain couldn't fully comprehend. Chen and his team returned fire, their weapons sending bursts of blue light into the darkness, striking down some of the advancing figures. Margaret's heart pounded as she shielded the baby with her body. "What do I do?" she gasped, looking desperately at Chen. "Run," he said. "Take her and go." "Go where?" "Follow the bears." Margaret didn't hesitate. She ran. The flight into the wild with the baby pressed against her chest. Margaret sprinted through the shattered clinic, following the massive shadow of the mother bear. The other bears flanked her, moving like living sentinels, their bodies crackling with power. She heard the sounds of fighting behind her, the screams of Omega soldiers as they realized they weren't just fighting animals. The bears were more than animals now. The trees blurred past her as she stumbled into the thick forest, branches whipping against her skin. The mother bear let out a low growl, a sound filled with urgency. Margaret understood. Move faster. She ran until the cold air burned her lungs, her body screaming for rest. But the baby remained eerily calm, her bright blue eyes glowing faintly in the shadows of the trees. And then, just when Margaret thought she couldn't go any further, the ground beneath her shifted. No, not shifted. Opened. The earth split apart before them, revealing a hidden passage, a tunnel that hadn't been there moments before. A secret place, a place made for escape. The mother bear leaped down first, disappearing into the darkness below. Margaret hesitated for only a second, then clutched the baby tightly and jumped. The hidden sanctuary Margaret landed hard, her knees buckling, but strong hands caught her before she could fall. Hands, not paws. She looked up, gasping. Humans. They stood in the underground cavern, their clothes blending with the stone walls, their eyes reflecting the same electric glow as the bears above. Some had tattoos identical to the one on the baby's wrist. Others bore subtle scars, evidence of experiments that had begun long before Margaret ever stepped foot in that clinic. A woman stepped forward, older, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a long braid, her expression both serious and knowing. "Welcome, Margaret Holden," she said, her voice smooth as riverstone. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" she whispered. The woman glanced at the baby in Margaret's arms, then at the bears above. "We are the ones who remember," she said, and with that, the hidden door sealed behind them, cutting off the outside world. Nothing would ever be the same outside. The battle raged on. Omega would keep coming. The world above would soon know the truth. But down here, in the hidden depths of the earth, a new future was beginning. One that had been waiting for far too long. The awakening of two worlds. Margaret Holden could feel it now. The pulse of something ancient, something alive beneath her feet. The baby's touch sent a flood of images into her mind. Not just memories, not just knowledge, but a presence. A force older than history itself, waiting, watching. A network of energy pulsed beneath the mountains. Not just a power source, but a living connection between all things. The bears had always known about it. Dr. Patel had discovered its potential. And Omega wanted to control it. The baby's bright blue eyes bore into Margaret's own, and suddenly she knew why they had brought the child to her. She wasn't just a nurse. She was the key to reawakening something the world had forgotten. The race to the depths. Another explosion ripped through the clinic, sending tremors through the floor. "They're breaching the lower levels," Dr. Reynolds shouted, staring at the flickering holograms on her now damaged tablet. The black-armored Omega soldiers were pushing forward, moving with cold precision, their weapons primed. They didn't just want the quantum core. They wanted the baby. Margaret clutched the infant tighter, feeling the heat of the bear mother at her back. "We have to move!" Chen snapped, his military instincts taking over. "Now!" The bear mother rumbled, turning to face the advancing forces. The other bears gathered around her, their massive forms shimmering, their eyes burning with the same blue fire as the baby's. "Go!" she growled. "Protect future." The words were clearer now, the connection between human and bear growing strong. And for the first time, Margaret understood completely. She turned and ran toward the underground levels, the baby clinging to her, the air thick with raw energy. Into the heart of the mountain the moment they descended into the hidden tunnels. Margaret felt the hum of something alive in the stone itself. The walls weren't just rock. They were etched with symbols, ancient equations, and diagrams that pulsed with a soft blue light. Some markings were thousands of years old. Others were fresh. The bears had been adding to them. Chen led the way, his weapon drawn, though it was clear that conventional firearms wouldn't matter anymore. "The chamber is just ahead," he said, his voice tense. Dr. Patel believed it was a doorway. Margaret spoke without thinking, because she could see it now. Ahead of them, at the very heart of the mountain, was a massive stone archway covered in glowing sigils. A gateway not to another place, but to another understanding. This wasn't just a secret lab. It was a bridge, a place where humans and bears had once stood side by side, connected by a knowledge that had long since been erased. And now it was waking up. The final confrontation, the Omega forces breached the tunnels just as Margaret and her group reached the chamber. "Stop!" One of the soldiers barked, his voice mechanical through his helmet. "Surrender the child." Margaret turned to face them, the baby glowing in her arms, the bears standing behind her, their bodies shifting between solid and something more than physical. "No," she said simply. Omega opened fire. Red energy beams streaked through the air. But before they could make contact, the baby reached out. A shockwave of blue light erupted from her tiny hands, stopping the weapons mid-air. The energy crackled and disintegrated, fizzling into nothing. Then, one by one, the Omega soldiers began to tremble. Margaret could see it happening. The baby's power was rewriting them, unraveling their forced transformations, stripping away the artificial blocks that had been placed on their own connection to life itself. Their bodies shuddered, their armor flickering. One of the soldiers collapsed to his knees, his helmet falling away to reveal a face twisted in shock. "Hey," he gasped, his voice breaking. "I can hear them. I can hear the earth." The others began to stumble backward, their weapons forgot. The baby's energy wasn't just stopping the fight. She was reminding them of something lost. Something older than war, older than fear. The awakening, the archway behind Margaret came alive, the symbols flaring to life in golden blue light. Dr. Paddle's voice whispered through the chamber, though she was nowhere to be seen. "You are the bridge." Margaret felt her body grow lighter, her mind opening. For one perfect moment, she saw it all. The first humans and bears standing here, eons ago. The shared knowledge of how to heal the earth, how to restore balance, how to exist together, not as separate species, but as one great symphony of life. The bears had never been animals. They had been waiting for humanity to remember. A new beginning. The Omega soldiers, their armor crumbling into dust, lowered their heads. They had lost, not because they were defeated, but because they had been set free. Margaret turned to the bear mother, who watched her with eyes that now looked fully, undeniably human. "What happens now?" Margaret whispered. The mother bear stepped forward, placing one massive paw over Margaret's hand. "We heal," she said. And this time Margaret understood. The world would never be the same, and that was exactly how it was meant to be. The descent into truth. Margaret Holden felt as though she had stepped beyond time itself. The walls shifted with light, flickering like memories preserved in stone. As she descended deeper into the hidden chamber, the glowing symbols surrounding them pulsed in harmony with the baby's heartbeat. She had seen plenty of strange things in her life. Nights filled with tragedy and miracles at Pine Grove Valley's clinic. But this was something else entirely. The bear mother, walking beside her, no longer just an animal but something more, watched her carefully. The other bears, their eyes shimmering with quantum energy, followed close behind, moving like sentinels, their massive forms filling the ancient corridor. Chen and his team stayed close, weapons ready, though it was clear that guns wouldn't matter here. The ancient chamber awakens at last. The staircase leveled out into a vast underground space. The ceiling stretched high above, carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift and flow like liquid gold. But it was the center of the chamber that stole Margaret's breath. A monolithic structure pulsed with blue light, suspended in midair like a heart beating within the mountain. The quantum core. It wasn't a machine in the traditional sense. It was something alive. Margaret could feel it in her bones, a presence humming with knowledge, with memory. And beneath it, Omega's soldiers worked tirelessly, setting up their dampening devices, preparing to sever the connection between species forever. The bear mother growled low in her throat. Must stop them. If they shut core, all is lost. The baby in Margaret's arms reached out, her tiny fingers glowing, and suddenly Margaret felt it, the overwhelming rush of knowledge flooding into her. If you're still watching this story, drop a groan in the comments to let us know you're here. She gasped, falling to her knees as visions exploded in her mind. The first humans and bears standing together in this very chamber. A partnership that had once flourished, then been erased from history. The betrayal, the choice to separate. And now the chance to restore what had been lost. The last stand. Margaret forced herself to her feet, heart pounding as she turned to Chen. We can't let them shut it down. Chen nodded, eyes narrowing. We fight. The bear mother let out a roar, and the other bears charged forward, their bodies flickering between flesh and quantum energy as they collided with the enemy forces. Omega's soldiers reacted fast, firing their red energy weapons, but the bears moved too quickly, their forms phasing between dimensions, their attacks hitting like thunder. Chen and his team opened fire, targeting the dampening devices with precision shots. Margaret could barely breathe as she cradled the baby, feeling the war for the future unfolding around her. And then, one of the Omega agents reached the core. A man in high-tech armor, his visor pulsing with dark energy, lifted a device toward the quantum core. If he activated it, everything would be lost. Margaret reacted before she could think. She ran straight toward him. The moment of choice, he turned at the last second, eyes widening in shock. Margaret held out the baby. The light from the infant's eyes met his. A shockwave rippled through the chamber, halting everything in place. Bears, soldiers, soldiers. The core itself. And in that instant, Margaret saw his memories. Not an Omega soldier. Not really. A man who had once been a scientist. Someone who had believed in transformation, in unity. Someone who had been forced into this war against his will. Tears filled his eyes. He remembered. He dropped the device. The dampening machines began shutting down, and the quantum core blazed brighter than ever before. The battle was over. But something even bigger was about to begin. The true awakening. The energy in the chamber shifted, a force beyond time and space, wrapping around everyone inside. The walls shimmered, and Margaret heard a voice she had only known through memories. Dr. Paddle. She wasn't gone. She was here within the core. The bear mother stepped forward, her massive form glowing with understanding. Time to finish what we began. Margaret nodded, pressing her hand to the core's surface. A flood of light erupted from the monolith, flowing outward, stretching beyond the chamber, beyond the mountain, beyond Pine Grove Valley. The world remembers for the first time in centuries. The forgotten knowledge returned. Humans everywhere felt something stir deep inside them, a pull toward something ancient, something they had been missing without even knowing it. Bears paused in their forests, their eyes glowing with newfound clarity. The world itself seemed to exhale. Margaret felt a shift in her own body, an understanding of transformation that went beyond science, beyond words. She had changed, and so had the world. A new future as the energy finally settled. Omega was gone. Not defeated by war, but by understanding. Margaret turned to the bear mother, to Chen, to the baby in her arms. Everything was different now. What happens next? Chen asked quietly. Margaret smiled. We rebuild. We remember. We heal. We remember. And as she looked out at the glowing core, she knew this was just the beginning. The awakening of memory, Margaret Holden could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. The sheer magnitude of what was happening, making her heart pound. The walls of the chamber pulsed with living equations, shifting symbols older than human civilization. The quantum core's light intensified, syncing perfectly with the baby's heartbeat. And then Dr. Paddle's voice filled the chamber, not from her body, still suspended in the quantum field, but from the network itself. You were never meant to forget. The words vibrated in Margaret's bones. The soldiers hesitated. Even Thomas Blackwood, who had entered the chamber with the arrogance of a man who believed he could claim the secrets of the universe for himself, looked uncertain now. The air crackled with energy, and the bears began to hum, their deep voices harmonizing with the very pulse of the chamber itself. Margaret felt herself drawn into the connection, an invisible thread pulling her into something vast and ancient. For a fleeting moment, she saw through the eyes of the first humans, small, fragile creatures trying to survive in a harsh world. They had been lost, starving, wandering through snow and ice. Then, a massive shape had appeared before them, not as a predator but as a guide, a protector. The first bear, not a beast, but something far more. A teacher. The great lie. Margaret staggered under the sheer force of the revelation. The knowledge flowed into her, undeniable and absolute. Humanity had never tamed nature. It had simply forgotten the bond that once existed. The great separation, the belief that mankind had evolved beyond the wild, was a lie. The bears had retreated, waiting for humans to be ready to remember, to awaken. Thomas Blackwood took a step back, gripping the quantum detonator like a lifeline. No, this isn't history, it's story. Dr. Paddle's body descended slowly, her presence more than human now. She was no longer just a scientist, she was a bridge between past and future. Deny it all you want, she said, her voice layered with something that sounded almost celestial. But you feel it. The connection. The truth. You were never meant to control this power, Thomas. You were meant to share in it. The baby in Margaret's arms let out a sound that was both a cry and a song, a harmonic resonance that shattered the illusions of control. The soldiers' weapons powered down. Their visors flickered, failing. Their bodies trembled as something deep inside their DNA recognized the forgotten bond. A memory buried so long it had turned to myth. But Blackwood resisted. He snarled, gripping the detonator tighter. If I can't control it, no one can. The quantum surged before he could press the detonator. The bear mother moved. Not with brute force, but with understanding. She stepped forward, her form shimmering between flesh and energy, her massive paw reaching out, not in violence, but in an offering. We do not fight with fear. Her voice rumbled through the chamber. We share knowledge. Choose Blackwood. Be part of the world that is coming, or be left behind. Margaret held her breath. Would he listen? Would he remember? The core pulsed, and suddenly, Blackwood's mind was no longer his alone. The moment of truth, the connection dragged him in, deeper than he had ever wanted to go. He saw the ancient past through the eyes of a child, a small boy watching his father tell him that the world belonged to those strong enough to take. He saw himself growing up being taught that control was the only way to power. And then he saw the truth. The world didn't need control. It needed harmony. He staggered, his fingers twitching over the detonator. Margaret saw the war waging inside him. Decades of belief, of ambition, unraveling in the face of undeniable truth. For a moment, the chamber was silent. And then, the detonator fell from his hand. He let out a breath that sounded like surrender. His voice cracked. I didn't know. The bear mother rumbled. Now you do. The world awakens as if in response. The core ignited. Light surged through the walls. the equations, the mountain itself. The ancient knowledge, the bridge between species, was no longer buried beneath fear. It was free. Margaret felt the connection expand outward, reaching beyond Pine Grove Valley, beyond the mountains, beyond the world itself. She felt humans everywhere stirring, their instincts shifting. She felt bears in distant forests raising their heads, understanding that they were no longer alone. And then she felt something even greater, something older than the bears, older than humanity itself, a presence in the core that had been waiting, watching. And now it had awakened. The future rewritten, Margaret gasped as the visions faded, her body trembling from the sheer force of the connection. Blackwood staggered back, his face pale, his hands shaking. The soldiers lowered their weapons, their minds no longer bound by their former orders. Dr. Patel stepped forward, her form fully restored, no longer just data in the quantum field, but alive once more. The bear mother bowed her massive head. Margaret looked at the baby, who gazed back at her with impossibly ancient eyes. She understood. The world would never be the same again. Not after this. Margaret turned to Chen. What now? He exhaled slowly, watching as the core's light settled into something peaceful, steady. No, we rebuild. The bear mother rumbled. Now we teach. Margaret nodded, stepping forward into a future where nothing was impossible, where humans and bears would no longer be separate, where they would remember together. And in the glow of the quantum core, the world finally awoke. The choice that shaped the future, Margaret Holden could feel the entire universe holding its breath. The air in the chamber shimmered as the quantum core pulsed in sync with the baby's heartbeat. The holograms displaying possible futures swirled around them, one of domination, one of harmony, and one of destruction. The baby's tiny fingers, glowing with impossible energy, brushed against Margaret's cheek, and for a fleeting moment she saw everything. She saw Earth's ancient past, when humans and bears had worked together as equals, when knowledge was freely shared. She saw 1,000 possible futures, stretching out like threads of light in the vast expanse of time. And beyond Earth, she saw other civilizations, species who had already faced the same choice standing before her now, to rule or to unite. The truth of the quantum network. Dr. Patel, now fully restored from the quantum field, stepped forward, her body illuminated by the shifting energy around them. The bears didn't just discover quantum consciousness, she said, her voice thick with revelation. They built it. The weight of those words staggered Margaret. This network isn't just a source of knowledge, Patel continued. It's a living bridge between worlds, a way for all intelligent life to connect beyond speech, beyond physical barriers. And we're standing at the threshold of whether that connection thrives or is lost forever. Blackwood stood frozen, his hand still gripping the detonator, but his face was pale, his eyes darting between the shifting equations and the child glowing in Margaret's arms. We can control it, he insisted, his voice lacking the confidence it had before. We can guide humanity's evolution. No, the bear mother rumbled, her form expanding, her fur now more like starlight than flesh. Evolution is not a weapon, it is a path. The battle between control and harmony. The moment snapped as the red warning lights flared, a piercing alarm cutting through the chamber. Through the unseen entrance, Blackwood's reinforcements had arrived. More armored soldiers, weapons glowing with synthetic energy designed to disrupt quantum fields. Sir, one of them shouted, barely hesitating at the sight of the impossible scene before them. We've locked onto the core. We can shut it down. Margaret's breath hitched. Shutting down the core wouldn't just cut the connection. It would erase it. The memories, the wisdom, everything the bears had safeguarded for millennia would be lost. She looked at Blackwood. You can't. If you do this, I won't let them, he whispered. Before Margaret could process his words, Blackwood threw the detonator to the ground and crushed it beneath his boot. Gasps filled the room. Even his own soldiers froze. "You're right," he admitted, voice hollow. "I felt it. The connection. The truth." His hands trembled as if fighting a war within himself. "But they'll never let this stand. They'll come back with more weapons, more ways to tear this apart." The baby's decision. The baby stirred again, her eyes locking onto Blackwood's. And suddenly, she wasn't just an infant anymore. Margaret could feel it, her mind stretching outward, reaching into the quantum network, into the soldiers, into the walls themselves. The chamber hummed, equations shifting, rewriting reality. Margaret understood in a flash of pure insight. The child wasn't just meant to be a bridge between species. She was the first true consciousness born from the network itself, a being capable of reshaping how life perceived itself. The baby lifted one tiny hand and the very air rippled with change. The soldiers lowered their weapons, their faces softened. For a moment, they were no longer invaders, no longer agents of destruction. They were simply humans, and they remembered. One by one, they stepped back, and Margaret realized that the choice had already been made. Not by her, not by Blackwood, but by the child. She had chosen harmony. The end of the great separation, the bear mother let out a deep, resonant sound, one that shook the foundations of the mountain. The quantum field surged outward, expanding beyond the chamber, beyond the valley, touching the world itself. Margaret felt it rippling through the earth, waking something deep and primal. Across the world, bears lifted their heads, as if recognizing the shift. Humans paused, feeling a strange sense of understanding bloom within them. The connection had returned. Dr. Patel turned to Margaret, her expression filled with awe and certainty. "It's done," Margaret exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing into her chest. The baby in her arms smiled, and in her eyes, Margaret saw the future unfolding. Not one of control, not one of war, but one of unity. And in that moment, she knew the world would never be the same again. The awakening of two worlds. Margaret Holden stood at the threshold of an impossible decision, the weight of the universe pressing down upon her. The chamber hummed with power, the quantum network pulsing like the heartbeat of an ancient sleeping world, just beginning to stir. The equations on the walls weren't just shifting anymore. They were singing, a melody woven through time, a call to something greater than any one species. The baby in her arms was the key. But Margaret had begun to realize that this was never about just one child. It was about the entire course of humanity's future. She looked at Blackwood, who still clutched the quantum detonator, his face pale, his once unshakable certainty fracturing under the weight of revelation. He had sought control, believing that humanity needed a firm hand to guide its evolution, to force progress through dominance. The bear mother, now something beyond flesh and blood, beyond any creature Earth had ever known, stood tall, her form shifting with ancient power. She was the past, the present, and the future of her kind. All bears that had come before, and all that would follow. "The time of separation must end," she said, her voice resonating through every living thing in the chamber. "The earth has waited long enough." The final confrontation, a deep rumbling, shook the walls as Blackwood's reinforcements arrived, their dark figures emerging from hidden tunnels. Their weapons, designed to suppress transformation and sever neural connections, glowed with a terrible crimson light. Blackwood's soldiers hesitated as the energy of the quantum network rippled through the chamber, touching their minds with glimpses of what could be, visions of a world healed, of civilizations rising not through conquest, but through understanding and unity. Some lowered their weapons. Others, still bound by fear, tightened their grips. Blackwood's jaw clenched. "You still don't understand. If we don't control this power, someone else will." "You mean someone like you?" Margaret shot back, taking a step forward. The baby in her arms was glowing brighter now, her tiny fingers curling as arcs of energy danced along her skin. "We were never meant to own this power, Blackwood. We were meant to be a part." For a fraction of a second, she saw doubt flicker across his features. Behind him, Dr. Patel's fully restored form floated above the quantum core, her presence radiating a deep, calm certainty. She had seen the full scope of humanity's potential, and she wasn't afraid anymore. "This isn't about controlling evolution," Patel said softly. "It's about remembering it. The baby's choice, the baby's stir." Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she felt something immense moving through her mind. It wasn't just the child reaching out. It was something older. Something that had been waiting in the quantum field for this very moment. For the first time in history, the network wasn't just a bridge between species. It was a door opening wider than ever before. The child lifted her tiny hand, and the walls of the chamber dissolved into a field of stars. They were no longer just in a mountain beneath Pine Grove Valley. They were everywhere. Margaret saw Earth as it truly was, a living, breathing entity intertwined with the consciousness of all who had ever walked upon it. She saw humanity standing at the edge of something vast, on the verge of either ascending into something greater or falling back into the darkness of fear and isolation. And then she felt the baby's decision. A pulse of energy exploded outward, sweeping across the chamber. The black-armored soldiers were lifted from their feet, their weapons short-circuiting as the quantum core surged. The network didn't destroy them. It showed them the truth. It showed them what had been lost, what could be regained. Blackwood stumbled back, eyes wide in terror as the baby's light touched him. His fingers flexed around the detonator, but before he could react, the bear mother stepped forward. "No more." She raised her massive paw and gently pressed it against his chest. Not in violence, but in understanding. For the first time in his life, Blackwood felt what it was to be part of something greater than himself. His breath hitched. Tears formed in his eyes. And then he let go. The detonator fell to the ground harmlessly. The world awakens as the light of the quantum network reached its peak. Margaret felt a shift so deep, it resonated through time itself. The division between species, between past and future, dissolved. The Earth, at last, remembered itself. All across the world, bears lifted their heads, feeling the shift. People woke from restless sleep, their minds touched by something both new and ancient. In the royal city of Aldermere, hidden records unfolded from within the walls of ancient buildings, revealing truths long buried by those who feared them. In the depths of the oceans, creatures older than civilization stirred, recognizing the change. And in Pine Grove Valley, the first true partnership in millennia had begun. Margaret held the baby close as the light around them softened. The quantum network didn't disappear. It had simply become part of them all. Dr. Patel, now standing solidly on the ground, let out a breathless laugh. "We did it." Margaret turned to the bear mother, who now shimmered between form and energy, past and future. "What happens now?" The great bear smiled. "Now, we teach the world how to remember." And as the first rays of sunlight streamed into the chamber, Margaret knew nothing would ever be the same again. The choice that changed everything. The chamber hummed with power, the crystal columns pulsing in perfect synchronization with the baby's rapidly expanding consciousness. Margaret Holden could feel time bending around them, the past, present, and future, no longer distinct points, but one continuous moment, flowing like a river through all of existence. The bears had always known. They had been waiting, guiding humanity through hidden knowledge, passing down the secrets encoded in sacred sites, in ancient carvings, in the very DNA of those destined to awaken. The moment had come, not just for humanity, but for the world itself. Blackwood's trembling hands clenched around the detonator. His face was pale, his carefully constructed ideology crumbling under the sheer weight of what the quantum network was revealing. "If we allow this," Everything we know will change, he said, his voice hollow. All our hierarchies, our control systems, our power structures, they'll collapse. That is the point, the bear mother said. Her form had become something more than physical, shifting between flesh and pure quantum energy. Her eyes, once golden brown, now burned with starfire, ancient wisdom flowing through them. You have built walls between yourselves and the universe, she continued. You believe control is the only way to survive, but the truth has always been in front of you. Life is not meant to be controlled. It is meant to evolve. Margaret could feel the presence of countless civilizations watching through the quantum network, waiting to see what humanity would choose. Some had taken this step before and ascended. Others had failed, choosing fear over growth. This moment was the test. A future worth fighting for through the baby's mind. Margaret saw what was possible. A world where species were no longer divided, where humans and animals shared knowledge, coexisting in ways that had been lost to time. She saw medicine rewritten using techniques that had once belonged to the Earth's first healers. She saw ecosystems restored, humans learning not just to take from nature, but to listen to it, to exist within it. And she saw something even greater, a future where humanity's consciousness no longer ended at the boundaries of its own mind, but flowed seamlessly into the universe itself. This was what the bears had been protecting. This was the truth. But Blackwood still held the detonator. If he activated it, the psychic shockwave would erase all of this from humanity's memory. Again, it had happened before. It could happen again. His eyes flickered, torn between fear of losing control and a glimmer of understanding. "What happens if I let go?" he whispered. Margaret took a step forward, the baby glowing like a star in her arms. "We remember," she said simply. "We evolve." The breaking point, but before Blackwood could make his choice, the walls of the chamber shuddered. A new force was coming. Through the quantum network, Margaret sensed them. The last remnants of those who had long sought to suppress humanity's growth. Those who had spent centuries keeping knowledge buried. The final defenders of control. The air cracked with energy weapons as a squad of armored figures stormed the chamber, their helmets shielding them from the expanding consciousness. Their weapons weren't designed to kill, but to erase, to sever the connection between species before it could fully take hold. "They will not stop," the bear mother warned. "They will burn the very fabric of this reality, if it means preserving their illusion of power." Margaret felt it then. The last chance. The last moment to decide. Blackwood turned, seeing the oncoming soldiers. His fingers twitched over the detonator, but for the first time, Margaret saw uncertainty in his eyes. The baby's consciousness touched his mind, showing him who he had been before he chose fear. A boy, staring at the night sky, dreaming of a world without boundaries. A man, once hopeful, before he had convinced himself that control was the only way to survive. And finally, this moment, the realization that he could be part of something bigger than himself, if only he had the courage to let go. The choice that changed the world. The first red blast of energy surged toward them. Margaret braced herself, but Blackwood turned, and he let go. The detonator clattered to the ground as the baby's glow exploded outward. A wave of pure, unfiltered quantum energy erasing the weapon's effects before they could reach the bears, before they could sever the link. The shock wave rippled through the soldiers, their helmets cracking, breaking, their own consciousness flooded with the truth they had been fighting to suppress. Margaret felt time itself shift, not breaking, but realigning. For the first time in centuries, humanity would not forget. The quantum network surged, rewriting the very fabric of perception, ensuring that what had been hidden would never be buried again. The dawn of a new era. The soldiers lowered their weapons, no longer enemies, but witnesses to something far greater than themselves. Blackwood fell to his knees, shaking, his mind adjusting to the enormity of what he had just done. Dr. Patel, now fully reformed, stepped beside Margaret, her voice filled with reverence and awe. "It's over," she whispered. "The forgetting is over." Margaret looked at the bear mother, who was now radiant, her form more energy than matter, her task finally complete. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. The bear mother smiled, her golden eyes filled with an understanding deeper than time itself. "Now we teach the world how to remember." And so they did. For the first time in thousands of years, the earth no longer belonged to one species alone. It belonged to all of them. The moment of awakening, the chamber pulsed with light, the crystal columns shifting between states of existence, solid, energy, thought, all at once. Margaret Holden felt herself standing at the threshold of something immense, something that stretched across time, through every moment of human and bear history, waiting for this choice to be made. The baby in her arms glowed, her tiny fingers pressing against Margaret's chest, and suddenly Margaret felt everything. Memories not just her own, but woven through the quantum network, through the very fabric of existence. She saw ancient hands painting stories onto cave walls, trying to preserve what would one day be forgotten. She saw bear cubs being led to places where the earth itself hummed with power, their mothers guiding them to understand something deeper than speech. She saw the long, slow divide, the moment when humanity chose control over connection, when it started forgetting its bond with nature, with the universe, with itself. And now she saw what could be. A future where consciousness expanded beyond physical limitations, where humans and animals worked together, not as separate species, but as part of the same great system of existence. She saw the earth healing not through force, but through understanding, through the very principles the bears had preserved for millennia. The final choice, Blackwood's fingers still hovered over the detonator, his face pale, his mind splintering between what he had believed and what the quantum network was now revealing. "If I let go," he said, his voice shaking, "everything changes." Margaret took a deep breath. "Yes," she said, "but not in the way you fear." Blackwood's eyes darted to the baby, then to the bear mother, who stood radiant, her form no longer entirely bound by physical limitation. "We've already changed," Margaret said. "You can feel it, can't you? The forgetting is ending. This isn't about erasing what humanity has built. It's about remembering what we were meant to become." The quantum network hummed, as if awaiting his decision. Behind Blackwood, his soldiers wavered, their weapons lowered, eyes wide with the knowledge surging through them. The baby's energy was touching them too, unlocking something primal, fundamental, something they had lost long ago. Margaret knew now that this moment was more than just a single decision. It was a turning point for all of humanity. The baby's tiny hand tightened against her chest, and a final surge of awareness flooded through her. The bears had always known this moment would come. They had waited, they had watched, and now it was time. Margaret met Blackwood's gaze, steady and unafraid. "You don't have to hold on to control," she said softly. "You just have to let go." Blackwood exhaled sharply, his hand releasing the detonator. The device clattered to the ground, and the world changed. The network unleashed, the chamber ignited with light, an explosion of pure energy, consciousness, memory, possibility. The quantum network, no longer suppressed, expanded like a tidal wave, flowing into every mind, every living thing, awakening something that had been dormant for thousands of years. Margaret felt the earth itself respond, as if taking a deep breath for the first time in centuries. She saw forests pulse with new vitality, oceans thrumming with energy, animals looking up toward the sky as if sensing the shift. She saw humans across the world pause, an inexplicable awareness dawning on them, a sense of belonging to something vast and ancient and infinite. The baby in her arms smiled, and in that moment Margaret understood. This wasn't just a technological awakening. This was the next step in evolution itself. A new beginning, the light faded, but the change remained. Blackwood stumbled back, his face a mixture of awe and fear. "It's done," he whispered. "We can't go back now. We were never meant to go back," the bear mother said. Margaret turned, seeing her form solidify once more, but now she was more than just a bear. She was a symbol of every guardian that had ever protected the Earth's secrets. Dr. Patel stepped forward, her eyes shining. "The network is stabilizing," she said. "The quantum harmonics are balancing naturally. We won't need to force humanity into this transformation. It will unfold like the bears always intended." Ew. Margaret looked at the baby, now peaceful, her task complete. "What happens now?" she asked. The bear mother smiled, her golden eyes filled with ancient understanding. "Now," she said, "we teach the world how to remember." The dawn of a new era outside, the world was waking up to something different. People were feeling shifts in their awareness, a sudden understanding of patterns they had never noticed before. They were hearing whispers of forgotten knowledge, recognizing that they were part of something much greater than themselves. In the cities, plants began growing faster, the natural world responding to the quantum shift. In the wilderness, animals moved differently, as if sensing a new harmony taking root in the world. And above them all, the stars shone brighter, as if welcoming humanity into a greater existence. Margaret held the baby close, realizing that her own consciousness had changed, that she could feel the network now, not as something separate, but as something that had always been inside her. She looked at Blackwood, who stood at the edge of the chamber, staring out at the new reality he had helped create. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice quiet. Margaret smiled. "We begin again," she said, "but this time we do it right." The bears roared, their voices carrying across the mountains, and the world listened. The threshold of awakening the chamber pulsed with energy, the crystal column radiating a glow that shimmered between dimensions. Margaret Holden stood at the very edge of humanity's greatest evolution, the baby in her arms, no longer just a child, but a bridge between past and future, between species and consciousness itself. Through the quantum network, she felt the eyes of an unseen audience, not just the bears and the humans present, but beings far beyond Earth, across time, across galaxies. They were watching, waiting. The bears had spent centuries preparing for this moment, not by forcing change, but by guiding humanity toward remembering what had always been possible. And now, it was time. Margaret turned her gaze to Thomas Blackwood, who still clutched the detonator, his face torn between fear and understanding. "If I let go," he whispered, "everything changes." Margaret met his stare, steady and unafraid. "Yes," she said, "but not in the way you think." The choice that would define the future, the air hummed with possibility, the equations on the walls shifting like a living organism, reacting to the quantum field expanding around them. Margaret felt the baby's presence merging with her mind, revealing more than she could ever have understood before. She saw the hidden history of Earth, the moments where humanity had almost remembered, only to be pulled back by fear and control. She saw civilizations on other worlds, some that had embraced this awakening, thriving in harmony with the consciousness of the universe, while others had rejected it, clinging to their limited understanding until their worlds crumbled into ruin. And now, Earth stood at the same crossroads. Dr. Patel's restored form shimmered with quantum light as she stepped closer. The bears didn't create them. They only preserved them. The capacity for expanded awareness has always been within us. Margaret felt a surge of understanding. This wasn't about forcing humanity into a new state of existence. It was about reminding them, step by step, a slow, natural transformation, just as a child learns to walk, one step, then another, until awareness becomes instinct. She turned back to Blackwood, whose hand shook over the detonator. "Control won't save you," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm. But trust might. For a moment, he hesitated. Then his grip loosened, and the detonator fell to the floor. The network unleashed, the chamber erupted with light, the crystal column flaring to life as the final barrier dissolved. The quantum network surged outward, expanding through every living thing, not as a forced invasion, but as an invitation. Margaret felt it ripple through her veins, through the baby's tiny form, through the bears, through every human in the room. And beyond them, across the mountains, into the forests, into the cities, into the hearts and minds of people who had never even known they were waiting for this. Across the oceans, past borders, past walls, into the collective consciousness of humanity itself. The world exhaled. And for the first time in millennia, it remembered. A dawn, unlike any other outside. The world began to change. People who had never understood why they felt a strange connection to nature suddenly saw it clearly. In cities, those who had spent their lives feeling separate and alone now sensed the threads of connection between them and every living thing. In forests, animals looked up toward the sky, their awareness deepening in ways science could not explain. Plants thrived. Ecosystems balanced themselves. Wounds began to heal, not through force, but through understanding. And above them all, the stars burned brighter, as if welcoming Earth into a greater family of existence. A new purpose. Margaret breathed deeply, feeling the shift within herself. She had been changed, not into something different, but into something more. She looked down at the baby, whose eyes, now filled with ancient light, blinked up at her. Dr. Patel stepped forward, awe in her gaze. "The network is stabilizing," she said. "The awakening is unfolding exactly as the bears intended." Margaret nodded, looking at the bear mother, who had taken a new form, one that pulsed with pure possibility, as if she were now part of something greater than herself. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. The bear mother smiled. "Now we teach." The world that awaits the battle was over, but the work had only just begun. Humanity had been given a gift, but like all gifts, it had to be understood before it could be fully embraced. Not everyone would awaken at once. Not everyone would be ready, and that was okay, because now the world had a path forward, a way to evolve without fear, without control, without destruction. Margaret turned to Blackwood, who stood at the chamber's edge, his eyes distant, as if he too was seeing what was possible for the first time. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Margaret smiled. "We begin again." The bears roared, their voices rising in a symphony that echoed through the mountains, through the sky, through the very soul of the earth. And this time the world listened, the awakening of humanity. The crystal column pulsed with an intensity that shook the chamber, its light refracting into hues beyond human vision, revealing not just new colors, but new layers of existence. Margaret Holden stood at the center of it all, the baby in her arms no longer just a child, but a conduit between two species, two realities, two destinies. The bears had waited for this moment, ensuring that when the awakening came, it would not be forced, but chosen. Now, it was time. The final choice. Thomas Blackwood, still gripping the quantum detonator, looked around the chamber, his expression torn between fear and understanding. The old world was slipping from his grasp, and he knew there was no going back. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "If this happens, if humanity changes, everything we've built will fall apart." Margaret met his gaze, her expression calm yet firm. "No," she said. "It will evolve." The equations on the walls shifted, displaying a timeline of human consciousness, its development not linear, but cyclical, like a spiral forever ascending. Agent Chen studied the tablet in his hands, its liquid surface shimmering with new patterns. "It's happening," he murmured. "Human consciousness is being recalibrated. The quantum network isn't just expanding, it's synchronizing." Dr. Reynolds, her military training now a distant memory in the face of what she was witnessing, took a deep breath. "It's like a planetary immune system," she said, watching the bears, the crystal column, the baby. "We were never meant to do this alone. The bears have been maintaining Earth's quantum field all along, waiting for us to be ready." Blackwood's fingers tightened around the detonator. "If I activate this," he warned, "everything goes back to how it was. Humanity stays in control." Margaret took a step forward, the baby's glow intensifying. "Humanity was never in control," she said softly. "We were just too afraid to see the truth." The bear mother stepped beside her, her form shimmering between dimensions, carrying the wisdom of all who had come before. "The time of separation is ending," she said, her voice reverberating through every soul in the chamber. Margaret looked at the baby, at the bears, at the quantum patterns woven into the very fabric of existence. And she knew. This wasn't just about accepting change. It was about choosing how to guide it. She turned back to Blackwood. "Let go." For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, Blackwood's hand relaxed. The detonator slipped from his grasp, and the crystal column erupted with light. The symphony of consciousness, the quantum network, surged outward, expanding not like an explosion, but like a song. A symphony of consciousness, resonating through every living being. Margaret felt it pass through her, through the baby, through the bears, beyond the chamber, across the mountains, across the forests, across the cities of the world. People felt something shift deep within them. Not a forced transformation, not an overwhelming flood of knowledge, but a whisper, an invitation. A memory stirring within their blood, a reminder of something they had once known, that life was meant to be connected, not divided. Margaret gasped, her vision expanding. She saw the network flowing into every human mind, unlocking long-dormant pathways. She saw children laughing as they instinctively grasped the knowledge of the universe, their eyes filled with wonder. She saw elders weeping as they finally understood the dreams they had carried their whole lives. The sense of something lost finally returned. She saw cities transforming, not into ruins, but into living ecosystems, where technology and nature worked as one. She saw Earth healing, its cycles restored, not by force, but by cooperation between species, between consciousness, between worlds. And beyond Earth, she saw other civilizations waiting, watching with hope. The bridge to the future. Margaret felt the baby's small fingers brush against her cheek, and suddenly, she was no longer just one person standing in a chamber beneath the earth. She was part of something greater, something that had been waiting for this moment for millennia. Dr. Patel, now fully restored, stood beside her, her eyes glowing with the same light as the baby. "The quantum network is stabilizing," she said. "The awakening is unfolding exactly as the bears intended." The bear mother stepped forward, her form now more light than matter. "Now we teach." Margaret turned to Blackwood, who stood in stunned silence. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice quiet, uncertain. Margaret smiled. "We begin again." The bears roared, a sound that shook the stars, a sound that carried across the world, a sound that wasn't a warning, but a welcome. And this time, humanity listened. A world reborn in the days that followed. The world changed, not in an instant, but in a way that felt as natural as the turning of the seasons. Some woke up the next morning with an understanding they couldn't explain, a sense of connection they had never felt before. Some resisted, clinging to the past, but found that the old ways no longer held the same power over them. Science shifted, no longer confined by rigid boundaries, but open to possibilities beyond measure. Medicine evolved, not just treating symptoms, but working with consciousness itself to heal. Technology blossomed, no longer at odds with nature, but woven into the rhythms of the earth. Margaret watched it all unfold. Standing on the threshold of this new world, the baby still in her arms, now simply a child again, her purpose fulfilled. She had been given a choice, and so had humanity. Not all would awaken at once. Not all would be ready. And that was okay. Because the door was open now, the path was clear, and for the first time in history, humanity was not walking it alone. The last guardian's farewell. Margaret turned toward the bear mother, whose form began to fade, her purpose complete. "Will we see you again?" she asked softly. The bear mother smiled, her eyes filled with timeless understanding. "We never left." And with that, she vanished into the light. Margaret took one last look at the crystal column, at the equations still shifting on the walls, their patterns now part of her own mind. Then, with the baby in her arms, with the quantum network humming all around her, she stepped into the future. The dawn of a new consciousness. The crystal column pulsed, not with blinding force, but with an elegance that seemed to breathe in time with the very fabric of existence. Margaret Holden stood at the center of it all, the baby in her arms now a living conduit, a bridge between two species, two realities, and two possible futures. The quantum network expanded, weaving itself into every consciousness present, not as an intrusion, but as a gentle remembrance. It was not a sudden shift, but a return to something that had always been there, waiting beneath the surface of human awareness. The last barrier falls. Blackwood took a step back, his hands trembling as the detonator dissolved into golden light, dissipating like dust into the quantum field. His breath was shaky, his face pale and haunted. "For so long," he whispered, "I believed control was the only path. That without it we would collapse into chaos." Margaret watched as his gaze moved toward the equations dancing along the chamber walls, the shifting symbols now singing a silent melody, a blueprint of evolution written in energy itself. "It was never about control," she said softly. "It was about connection." Agent Chen, eyes wide with scientific wonder, moved closer to the crystal column, his device shimmering with streams of light and data beyond human comprehension. "It's not rewriting us," he said, his voice filled with awe. "It's just reminding us." Dr. Reynolds, once the embodiment of military discipline, now stood transfixed, her fingers brushing against the transparent walls that revealed layered realities, countless dimensions existing within a single space. "This isn't an invasion of human consciousness," she murmured. "This is an invitation." The bear mother, her form shimmering between physical and quantum states, spoke in a voice that resonated through every soul in the chamber. "You were never alone. You only forgot." The return of the forgotten path. The baby stirred in Margaret's arms, her tiny hands reaching out as if to grasp the very air itself. Where her fingers touched the quantum energy, fractals of light bloomed, cascading in waves that spoke in a language older than words. Margaret felt it, not as a scientist, not as a nurse, but as a being awakening to something deeper than she had ever known. Through the baby's consciousness, she saw humanity's journey, the first ancestors who had walked beside the bears, the golden era of unity, the fall into separation, the long sleep of forgetting. And now, this moment, the return. "The bears never left us," Margaret whispered. "They've been waiting, guarding this knowledge." Dr. Patel, her form now fully restored, smiled as she stepped forward. "We were never meant to force evolution," she said. "We were meant to grow into it." The bear mother nodded, her massive form radiating a sense of profound patience. "The time of remembering has come," she said, her voice carrying the weight of millennia of silent waiting. A new future takes root outside. The world was changing. Across the forests, bears emerged from the shadows, no longer hiding, no longer just animals. Their eyes glowed with ancient knowing, their movements calm and deliberate. Across the cities, people woke with dreams of connection, their minds touched by something they couldn't quite name. A sense of belonging to something greater. Across the planet, barriers between species, between thoughts, between realities, began to dissolve. Not through destruction, but through understanding. The transformation had begun not with fire and upheaval, but with a quiet blooming of awareness. The first step into a greater reality. Margaret turned to Blackwood, who still stood paralyzed at the threshold of understanding. "You're afraid," she said. Blackwood exhaled sharply, his entire identity unraveling before him. "What happens next?" he asked. Margaret looked around the chamber. The floating equations, the pulsing network, the Bear Mother standing as guardian of a truth older than time itself. She smiled. "We begin again." The baby cooed, and in that sound was the first note of a new symphony, a song that would carry humanity forward into an age where knowledge was not controlled, but shared. A soft roar came from outside, not a warning, a welcome. The final guardian's farewell. The Bear Mother took a step back, her form beginning to dissolve into the quantum field, her presence no longer needed in the way it once had been. Margaret felt a pang in her chest. "Will we see you again?" she asked. The Bear Mother smiled. Her glowing eyes filled with eons of wisdom. "You always have." And then, with a final pulse of light, she was gone. The chamber walls, once covered in equations, became mirrors, not of reflections, but of possibilities. Margaret turned, the baby still in her arms, and took the first step into the world that had been waiting for them all along. A world reborn. The dawn outside was unlike any before it. Not because the sky had changed, not because the earth looked different, but because humanity could finally see it. Some would awaken instantly, feeling the quantum resonance shift through them. Some would take years, decades, lifetimes, moving at their own pace, at their own time, and that was how it was meant to be. Because this was never about force. It was about choice. A child had been born, a bridge had been built, and a door had been opened. But what lay beyond it, that would be for humanity to discover. Together. The first light of the new age. Margaret Holden stood at the edge of history, the weight of it pressing against her, the beauty of it filling her lungs like fresh air. She had been given a choice, and so had the world. And in the quiet hum of the quantum field, in the glow of the first light of true dawn, she knew they had chosen well. The story of Margaret Holden and the Bears is not just an epic tale of transformation. It is a reflection of our world today, of the choices humanity faces, and the profound ways in which we must evolve to survive and thrive. At its heart, the story teaches us that our greatest limitations are not external but internal, rooted in how we perceive ourselves and our connection to the world around us. Like the humans in the story who had forgotten their bond with the bears, we too have forgotten our deep connection to nature, to each other, and to the greater intelligence that permeates all things. The illusion of separation and the need to remember. For centuries, modern civilization has moved toward control rather than connection, structuring societies around dominance, over nature, over other species, and even over ourselves. We have built economies that exploit rather than sustain, governments that divide rather than unite, and technologies that disconnect rather than enhance our understanding of life. Yet, like the quantum network in the story, there has always been an underlying web of connection. A deeper intelligence that we have ignored in favor of systems that prioritize power over wisdom. But what if, like Margaret and the Bears, we are on the brink of remembering? What if the key to humanity's evolution is not more control, but more openness, not fear of change, but a willingness to grow into something greater than what we have been? Awakening consciousness in a world on the edge. Our world today faces a crossroads much like the one in Pine Grove Valley. Climate change, Political division, technological advancements, and ethical dilemmas have all forced us to question who we are and where we are going. We stand on the precipice of incredible transformation. But the path forward is unclear. Do we continue down the road of extraction, exploitation, and control, or do we step into a new way of being, one that acknowledges the intelligence of nature, the interconnectedness of all life, and the vast untapped potential within human consciousness? The bears in the story were not simply animals. They were guardians of wisdom, waiting for humanity to be ready to listen. What if nature itself is trying to teach us something? Indigenous cultures around the world have long understood this, viewing forests, rivers, and animals as teachers rather than resources to be exploited. Quantum physics is now beginning to echo what ancient traditions have always known: that consciousness itself is woven into the very fabric of the universe, and that human awareness is capable of far more than we currently understand. The path forward. From control to harmony, the lesson of the story is not that we need to abandon progress, but that progress must be guided by wisdom, not greed. Just as Margaret realized that transformation cannot be forced but must be nurtured, we too must learn that the solutions to our greatest challenges will not come from domination, but from collaboration. Technology should serve life, not replace it. Governments should unite people, not divide them. The economy should be based on sustainability, not endless consumption. Science should explore the mysteries of consciousness, not dismiss them. We should remember that we are not separate from nature. We are part of it. If we can embrace the wisdom of balance, we may yet find ourselves at the dawn of a new age, not one where we conquer the world, but where we learn to live in harmony with it. Like the first light of true dawn over Pine Grove Valley, humanity is on the verge of awakening to its own infinite nature. The question is, will we remember in time? Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of life. See you in the next story.